Well, welcome everyone to our CP Support webinar series. Today, our webinar is all about the path to competent in day 2. My name is Debbie Bayless. Before we begin, I want to extend a big thank you to CPA Western School of Business, CPA Ontario, and CPA Atlantic School of Business for their great partnership in ensuring that this valuable information is available to you as you prepare to write CFE this September. The presentation is approximately 70 minutes long, and then I will open the floor for any questions that you may have. If you have questions during this webinar, please use the Q&A function, and my colleagues will answer those questions. They may keep a few of them for our large Q&A session at the end. So again, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Now, due to time constraints, we may not be able to answer all of your questions. So please do not hesitate to reach out to your appropriate region or province. I've included their email addresses here for you. There are two common questions that are always asked. Is this webinar being recorded? And yes, it is. It should be available over the next few days, and you will find the recording, the link, under Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE, the news page. Candidates also ask, will they have access to the slides? Unfortunately, you will not. However, the benefit is you can re-watch the webinar, stop it at any point, and write your appropriate notes. So I'm hoping at this point in your development and your preparation to write CFE that you are aware of the critical step when it comes to planning. That's reading, creating your outline, and planning. So I'm going to spend some time reviewing the planning process, and I'm going to be sharing with you a best practice on how to create an efficient and effective outline for the Elgar Day 2 case. Now, I'm only going to be able to do a partial outline because of our time constraints. To increase your chances of preparing a competent response, I'm going to review the Board of Examiners' expectations. I'm also going to discuss the approach and the structure that I strongly recommend you use when you're performing quantitative and qualitative analysis. Structure matters. It increases the opportunity of you preparing a competent response. I'm also going to highlight some of the common problems that the Board of Examiners have seen when it comes to the candidate's financial reporting responses. And of course, I'm going to open the floor for any questions you may have. So let's start with critical reading, outlining, and planning. So what are the benefits of planning? There's really two main benefits. The first one is having a planned approach will help you remain calm. Now, I hope you've had an opportunity to already watch the stress management webinar. That recording is available under Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE on the home page under the news section. Because there I emphasize a key success factor in passing CFE is your ability to effectively control your stress, because it can be overwhelming. So having a planned approach, that will build confidence. It'll also give you a sense of control, and it will ensure that you approach cases in a consistent manner. It also will help you achieve the depth and breadth requirements that are needed to achieve a competent response. And later on, I'm going to define breadth and depth when I talk about the Board of Examiners' expectations. So the CFE cases, if you've had a chance to look at them, or if you're going to be looking at them shortly, I hope so, they can be very complex with lots of requireds and lots of case facts. So to be successful, you need an approach that logically organizes the assessment opportunities, so that's what you're being asked to do, and the respective case facts in a way that meets the user's needs. So I want to read word for word. This comes from the Board of Examiners. Planning is the cornerstone to CFE success and is the most important phase in approaching the case. Planning helps you see the big picture and lays the foundation for a well thought out response. So as a result, you should spend between 25 and 30% of the case length for planning. That's reading, creating your outline, and allocating the times for each of your requireds. Now, I know that that seems excessive, but remember, if you have a strong outline, you can turn that quickly into a response. Don't fall into that trap where you're feeling the pressure that you've got to start writing your response, because it's critical that you extract the relevant case facts. So why create an outline? Already I've talked about the importance of planning, and I've mentioned creating an outline several times. Well, it allows you to highlight those key case facts. So you're going to extract them and include them in your outline. It helps you manage your time, because if you have all the information in place, if you've got the structure in place that you need, you can quickly turn that outline into a response. It becomes the roadmap for your response. Once you've got everything completed, you can take a step back and you're able to see the big picture. And then you can allocate your time appropriately to each of those requireds. And again, you'll notice I use the word required or assessment opportunity. Means the same thing, what you're being asked to do. You can, base the time on what type of analysis do you need to perform and what amount of information do you already have. So the Board of Examiners' recent comments are their expectations is that candidates are required to integrate the information found in the simulation. In other words, the case, in order to demonstrate competency. So competency, you need to extract those relevant case facts. So when it comes to whether you create your outline on paper or electronic, in Word, there's no right or wrong answer. You need to figure out what's going to work best for you. When I coach candidates one-on-one, though, I do ask them to consider the following questions. Does it take you longer to read the case? Do you find that once you've started to write the cases that you're missing some of the requireds or you're missing some of the key case facts? Are you struggling to meet the breadth requirements? So the number of qualitative factors you need to identify based on the case facts. Are you feeling a big time crunch? If the answer is yes to any or all of those questions, I strongly encourage you to practice writing and practice preparing your outline in Word, because again, you're going to have the relevant information there, and you can take that and turn it very quickly into your response, opposed to having it on paper and then having to retype it into Word. Another area that candidates find challenging is, in some instances, they're unsure of what they're being asked to do. Well, when I create that partial outline for the Elgar Day 2 case, I'm going to show you a best practice, which is really to make sure that you write the required word for word. Don't paraphrase it, because if you paraphrase it, there may be many components that you need to do for that required. And if you paraphrase it and you miss one of those components, you've now significantly negatively impacted your ability to achieve a competent response. So for the next 20 minutes or so, let's create a partial outline for the Elgar Day 2 case. For those of you who are enrolled in Capstone 2, this is the case that you will be doing in the upcoming module workshop, or if you're watching the recording in the workshop that's already been done. I hope that the candidates who have been part of the professional education program, that you're very familiar with the 9-step planning process that CPA Canada recommends. When I create this outline, I'm going to go through each of these steps. So as you are aware, everyone is writing the same day 2 case. And I've enclosed here for you the table of contents because the information is divided. First of all, there's common information, background information that should be read by all roles. There's also common exhibits that need to be read by all roles. Within that information, there's information that could be applicable for your required for your roles, or some of that information is not applicable. There are specific requirements, and this is where it outlines the requirements for each of your roles. And you'll notice that that they're sorted alphabetically. So only focus on your specific role. I've highlighted performance management requirements because I'm going to go through those requirements today. Then you also have specific information, so specific appendices for your role. So when it comes to the first step of the planning process is to allocate time to planning. And CPA Canada recommends that you allocate a total of 90 minutes. And that's broken into 2 components. 75 minutes to read the case and create your outline. And then 15 minutes to take an opportunity to pause, reflect, plan what you're going to do, order those requireds, and allocate the time. So what I recommend to do, because it's critical that you manage your time, the goal is to complete all of the assessment opportunities to the best of your ability within the time frame that you have. And for those of you who haven't had an opportunity, I strongly encourage you to watch the recording in regards to understanding CFE, because I go into great detail in how CFE is marked. So let's look 90 minutes, and I'm going to put my start time 9 o'clock till 10:30. Again, because I want to watch my time. For rating, it's 210 minutes. So that's going to go from 10:30 to 2. I'm going to divide that time up once I've finished my outline and I have a good sense of what the requireds are and approximately how much time I will need for each of those. So the second step is to read the narrative. So there's some key information that's found in the narrative. That's where you find those requireds, those assessment opportunities, what you're being asked to do, your role, the users and their objectives, the timeline. So when it comes to your role, the users and their objectives and the timeline, that information can be used in a variety of ways. So for your role, it's what voice do you use when you write that memo? Are you an employee for the company? Are you a consultant? It's important to identify the users and their objectives. You might need that information when it comes to maybe you're asked to calculate materiality. So you need to identify the users and what their objectives are to determine an appropriate materiality base. The timeline. It's important to note the current date, when year end is, and any other dates that are provided, because it will help you identify a potential hidden issue. For example, say the current date is the end of July, and you need to perform both a quantitative and qualitative analysis for a particular option that's about a contract that needs to be implemented by the end of August. Well, that's a very short timeline. So that's an important con to consider. It could indicate that it might be not a viable option. Some of the best practices as you create your outline is to make sure that you use the required as a heading in your outline. And again, as I said, I need to repeat this. Make sure that you write the required word for word and break it down into smaller pieces. I've worked with candidates who are writing for the third time, and I've seen that when they wrote down the required, they paraphrased it and they missed key things that they were asked to do. Include those relevant case facts in your outline, again, so you could quickly turn it into a response. So because the common information is being read by every role, and that there's information there that you need, but there's also some information that you don't need, I strongly recommend that you first go to the required section for your role. Now you'll see on this slide and the future slides that I've included sections from the case. I've highlighted the information, and I've also shown in big bold letters where that information is going to fall when it comes to my outline. Now I've done that for illustration purposes only. I want you to see where I found the information and where it should go. However, when I'm creating an outline, I'm not going to spend time highlighting information, writing information on the case, and then typing it in. If it's important, if I need it, I'm going to include it in my outline. Let go of a few steps. Every moment counts. So in the first two paragraphs, or the first section, there's two requirements that we're being asked to do. The first one is to perform a variance analysis when it comes to platinum. So we need to look at the budgeted versus the actual. So we need to state whether those variances are favorable or unfavorable. Need to share those findings with the user. And I put a note to remind me, why is. Look for those case facts that would indicate why a particular variance is favorable or unfavorable, so that I can identify that and I could provide the user with some advice on what they need to do to mitigate that issue, or to are areas that they need to investigate. One of the things I find is it's important when you're thinking and you're writing your information down, if something comes to mind that you think, oh, I need to do that, write it in your outline. Don't assume that you're going to remember. There's a lot to do. So if it's top of mind, write it down. The next required is for the K3 press contract. And you're asked to perform both a quantitative and a qualitative analysis, and you need to provide a recommendation whether the K3 press contract should be canceled. So in the next paragraph, our required is about the ELGAR reporting package. And here I've already broken it down into components. What are they asking me? What do I need to do? So I need to review the measures. I need to provide improvements, recommend improvements, and I need to provide suggestions on how to better monitor the financial results that could assist NHC in their decision whether to further fund ELGAR. And so what I put is a little equal sign to me, again, to trigger that I need to provide them with recommendations on appropriate new measures. So the next paragraph, well, here are 4 different financial reporting issues that I need to analyze. So first of all, anytime you are analyzing financial reporting issues, it is extremely important that you use the IGAR format, or an extension of that is IGAR-I. The great news is when you create you create your outline in Word, you have the ability to copy and paste. So under foreign currency, I'm going to put issue, gap, analysis, recommendation, and the one that I'm adding is I for impact. And I'll talk about why that's important in a few minutes. So I can copy that format all 4 times. So I need to analyze foreign currency, K3 press contract, revenue under new marketing program, and the future dismantling of the battery construction facility. So in the next few paragraphs, there's 2 more requirements. So for Elgar's proposal, we need to compare the actual performance. And so I kind of put a bracket in, remind myself to talk about, did they achieve their goal? Was it not achieved? Was it exceeded versus the forecast? The next requirement is that they've asked us to identify the risks and provide mitigation strategies. So an appropriate format to use structure is a version of the WIR, which is risk, implication, and recommendation. So we have another 3 requirements. So for the 6-month cash flow forecast, we need to make the necessary changes. We need to identify the areas to reduce costs. In other words, I'm telling myself, remember, you need to provide recommendations on how to reduce costs. There is a relevant case fact that I want to include because they need to make sure that there's a minimum of 3 million cash balance at the end of each month. The 2 other requirements they're asking us to look into is piecework and electronic bicycle. And they're asking us to perform both quantitative and qualitative analysis and provide recommendations. So the proper format is quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis, recommendation. So again, I'll put that format under piecework, and then I'll just copy it again and paste it under electronic bicycle. Now, here are our last 2 requirements. When it comes to governance and oversight, they're asking us to recommend changes when it comes to the board of directors, the structure, and policies and procedures and processes. So again, an appropriate format to use when you're critiquing something is identify the weakness, state what the implication is, and provide an appropriate recommendation. For the performance management system, we are being asked we need to evaluate the current performance indicators. So I'm again writing a note to myself. I need to explain why the current performance indicator is appropriate or not. They're also asking us to provide recommendations. So I need to provide new measurements and I need to explain why. This is my note to myself, explain why they are appropriate. Simply stating and providing recommendations, new measurements is not enough. The user needs to understand why those are appropriate. So at this point, I've now identified all of the requirements. Before I even go and start looking at the appendices, I would recommend at this particular point that what you do is write down all those requireds and take a piece of paper, take one of the blank sheets in your rough booklet and write each of these down. You're going to do that at some point because you're going to have to allocate time to each of those requireds. But it's important to know what they are so that when you look at the common information, you're only going to extract what's relevant for the requirements that you need to do. So as you can tell, there are quite a few. Normally in a day 2 case, there's normally anywhere from 12 to 14 assessment opportunities. So the next 2 steps are, the third step is scanning the appendices and rereading the required. So that's why you should have that sheet of paper right beside you. And then to carefully read those appendices and organize the case facts. So when you're looking at that information, ask yourself, so what? When you're looking at the common information, ask yourself, how does this relate to the required, what you need to do? When you're looking at the role specific information, why were you given that information? I want to really stress when it comes to role specific information, if you're given an appendices, there you need to use it. Ask yourself, how does this information relate to the users and their objectives? When it comes to client statements, if the client says something and you think, that's not correct, it's very important to explain to the user why why it's incorrect and provide them with the appropriate advice. So when we look at the common appendices, we have 3 different appendix. One has some common information about Elgar. We've got some financial information. We also have some other information, and I see that that covers platinum inventory, K3 press contract, the key measurement report, foreign currency transactions, new marketing program, and battery construction facility. So there's lots of information there that I need for the required that I need to do. For the performance management appendices, there's information on Elgar's proposal, on Elgar's cash flow forecast, need that. Piecemeal, the electric bicycle performance proposal, and the performance indicator. So I'm going to need all that information. When you're reviewing the information in the appendices, pay very close attention to details. So in other words, look at the time frame. One of the things that I notice that commonly happens is maybe the time frame the financials are only covering 9 months, and you need to use that information to forecast yearly, the anticipated yearly income. So make sure that you're paying attention to that information. Who created that information? Is there potential for biasness? Make sure that you note your quantitative and your qualitative factors separately. Don't think that in the appendices, the only important information is the quantitative information. There's very important qualitative information. You need to extract that and include it in your outline. Integrate the case facts that apply across many of those required. So again, if a case fact is relevant for more than one required, write that case fact under the first required and then copy and paste it and put that information under the other relevant requireds. If you're asked to examine financial statements, there's several things you should be on the lookout for. So what type of assurance has been provided? If the financial statements are unaudited, that means that there's a good chance that adjustments need to be made. Look at the number of years that are presented. So if you are asked to calculate ratios, and you're presented with 3 years, that means you need to calculate the ratios for all 3 years. It also means that you need to discuss the trend. Is the ratio improving? Is it getting worse? Or is it stable? Are there line items with large dollar amounts? Are there large changes from year to year? Is there something that you'd expect to see, but it's not present? Or something you would not expect to see and it is present? Because those are good indicators that you may need to make some adjustments. So let's look at the background information. And again, this is information available for all of the roles. So we're only going to extract what we need based on what performance management requirements are. So first of all, the users and their objectives. So NHC, they own 100% of Elgar, and they want to sell Elgar, or they want to assure that at least it produces a steady cash flow. So that's important to them. Martin is the CEO. Denise is the head of the investigation team. Charlene is the director for Canadian investments. Robin is the Elgar CEO, and Sam is the Elgar's CFO. And your role is you're part of NHC's investigation team. Now, there's always some important qualitative information in the narrative. To make sure you don't lose that information, I strongly recommend that you just include a section, quantitative information, in your outline. So here it talks about that the expectation is the return on investment of 25% after tax. I might need that information because I know I need to perform some quantitative analysis. So let's look at the next few paragraphs. Well, already we've got some weaknesses when it comes to governance and oversight. So when it comes to the board of directors, I'm just going to haul out the relevant information and put under weakness that Robin is Elgar's CEO and he's the only board member. I'll go back and put in what the implication is and the recommendation. Also, another weakness is that there's no formal oversight or approval of Elgar's policies by NHC. The next paragraph, here's another weakness. So Charlene, she just performs a brief review of Elgar's monthly report packages and then archives the report. So already I've got a good start when it comes to the governance and oversight required. And the next paragraph, I need to record the timeline. And the case that you're looking at, the time frame might be the date. It's probably 2026 instead of 2022. And what is year end? Here's some more important quantitative information. I'm probably going to need it, so let's extract it and put it in my outline. So it was forecasted that Elgard would achieve 1 million pre-tax for year end, but the actual result was a loss. They sold 812 units, and the average sale price was $37,806. So let's now look at the Appendix 1. Well, here's some valuable information that I absolutely need. So the accounting framework that they're using is IFRS. So under GAAP, I'm going to put IFRS. And I'm going to copy that and put it under every one of my financial reporting issues. Also, here's some more quantitative information. The tax rate is 28% and the borrowing rate is 8%. They provide us with the mission statement. And so I know that, hey, when it comes to looking at the electronic bicycle from a qualitative perspective, I should talk about whether this option is aligned or at least partially aligned with the company's mission statement. So I'm going to include the mission statement under that particular required. Now, the next few paragraphs, there's several risks here. And one of our requirements is to identify the risks. So let's pull the information, let's extract it and input it into our outline. So the first risk is large competitors offer special financing terms. Another is prices significantly higher than fuel-powered vehicles. Another, limited charging stations. And the last risk is there's a limited customization, only color. So again, now I've already identified those appropriate risks and I need to come back when I create my response, turn that outline into a response, input my implication and recommendation. So because of limited time, I'm only going to look at two of the appendices for the common information. So you'll notice here that I've actually in bold letters and underlined quite a bit of quantitative information. When you write the day two case, as you've seen, there's many requireds. So you may simply just want to put in your outline the page number. And this is where, if you're just going to put the page number for the quant information, then this is where you would highlight the relevant information so that when you come back, you could quickly find it. It's up to you. When I do the time management and day three, I'm going to show you a bit of a different version because the approaches are different for day two than day three. Day three is very time constrained. So I'm going to show you a best practice of extracting the relevant quantitative information and inputting in Excel, but it doesn't work well for day two. One of the things that I definitely want to extract and make sure that I include in the outline is I need to find those relevant case facts that could explain the reason for the variances. And there are several reasons that already are identified. There's limited inventory counts, that scientists from the R&D department, they have 24-hour access, that that waste, sometimes the disposal of the batteries, it's not recorded. So let's include that information in the outline. So again, it depends on what you want to do. I've included some of the key information, but I've also included the page number. Also, I know that I need to look at the flexible budget variance. So I'm kind of putting down what am I going to need to do, the efficiency variance and the price variance. And from a findings perspective, these are the key case facts that I need to emphasize. Now, these case facts are already alluding to that there's probably going to be an unfavorable efficiency variance. So if you notice and you calculate it and it's a positive, you know what, it's a favorable efficiency variance, I would double check my numbers because these case facts illustrate that there could be an unfavorable variance. So once you've read all of the case and completed your outline, step 5 is to take a step back and to pause. Ask yourself, how do the requireds and your analysis fit together? What's the most important issue for the person who's reading the report? And what's the most important issue for the users of the financial statements? Step 6 is all about planning what you're going to do. If you've used the best practice I'm sharing with you, and you need to practice it, it does take quite a bit of time to become efficient. You've already done a lot of your planning process. You've already identified When you need to perform a quantitative analysis, a qualitative analysis, what type of recommendations you need to make. An important consideration is you need to consider how do the requireds integrate. In other words, does your analysis and recommendation for one of the assessment opportunities impact your analysis and recommendations for another? If so, then that requirement needs to be addressed first before you do the next required. So let's talk about, and I want to provide a specific example of if you have financial reporting issues, those need to be analyzed first. You need to implement your recommendations, make the appropriate adjustments before you perform any other quantitative analysis. Step 7 and 8, you're really doing those in tangent. So that's ordering the required and ranking them. Making sure too that when you rank them, that there's a logical flow of response. So things that can consider from an order is the risk of the transaction, the impact on cash flow, the immediacy of need, whether it impacts future viability for the company, and simply the volume of coverage. If there's a lot of it, if there's a full appendices dedicated to it, this is an important issue. The last step is to allocate your time. So some factors to consider. Sometimes candidates just say, okay, I've got so many minutes left and I've got, these many required, therefore I'm just going to allocate the same amount of time for each required. No, that's not the appropriate approach. The factors to consider is how much information do you already have in the outline? And what type of analysis do you need to perform? If you need to perform a SWOT analysis and you have everything, you have the relevant case facts, and you just need to put in the why and the impact, that's going to take you a lot less time than if you need to perform a quantitative and a qualitative analysis before you provide a recommendation. Now, it's very important that you allocate that, not only allocate that time, but stick to your time budgets. Because again, the goal is to complete all the assessment opportunities to the best of your ability, because that increases your chances of passing each of those levels. And if you're not sure how CFE is marked, please make sure that you watch the recording for understanding the CFE. So here is the time allocation for each of those requireds based on how much information we've already extracted. So you can see that there's limited time allocated for each of those assessment opportunities. So let's spend some time talking about the quantitative and qualitative analysis. The general approach is that you should perform your quantitative analysis first, then your qualitative analysis. And the reason being is because you may find a hidden issue, a very important qualitative consideration. So let me give you a specific example. Say that you're calculating NPV and it's positive over a 5-year period. So it's viable from a quantitative perspective. However, the first 2 years, there's negative cash flow. Well, that's an important an important qualitative factor to consider. Why? Because the organization is going to have to use cash flow from its operations. If they don't have cash flow from their operations, they're going to have to finance that negative cash flow for those first 2 years. So each quantitative analysis, you should include a purpose and a conclusion in Excel. So when it comes to Excel, there's only one workable tab. So all of your calculations are performed in one tab. So therefore, it's really important that you include a purpose and a conclusion. And that should relate to what you're being asked to do and the user's needs. If you have a complex quantitative analysis, well then organize it in 2 sections. And that way it ensures that your response is clear, concise, and easy to follow. So the first section could include a high-level summary of your findings, while the second section would include the detailed calculations. So let me provide you with a specific example. So say that you are having to calculate business income, and there's many add backs and there's many deductions. So in the first section, you just have one line that would show the total add backs and the total deductions. In the second section, under the add backs, you would break each of those down individually. Therefore, your response is easy to follow. So in planning your quantitative analysis, there are really three tasks that you generally need to complete. But before I go through those, I need to emphasize this. You do not need to perform a perfect quantitative analysis to achieve a competent response. I need to say that again. You do not need to perform a perfect quantitative analysis to achieve a competent response. As you write the previous CFE cases and you debrief those cases, you'll become more familiar with kind of what is required for a competent response. So what are the three tasks that you need to do? You need to determine the purpose of your analysis. What's the question you need to answer? What information is available to you to perform that analysis? So what are the key inputs that you need? And in order to answer that question and provide the user with valuable information to make an informed decision, you need to select the right tool for the job. If you find that you struggle determining the appropriate quantitative analysis to perform, the upcoming time management webinar and day 3, I'm going to go through the popular quantitative tools. So make sure you attend that live webinar or that you watch the recording. Also, make sure that before you start your quantitative analysis, you determine the most effective approach. So if you need to recalculate net income, we'll start with the current net income and then make the appropriate adjustments. Don't start with the revenue, start with the current net income. Your quantitative analysis, that should be performed in Excel. Your response should be in Word. Your Excel calculations, they should not be copied into Word unless you've been specifically directed to do so. And I've never seen a case yet where you've been asked to do that. Now I need to highlight some very important information. So remember that the CFE marker, they don't have the ability to kind of ask you. They can't say, Debbie, can you explain how you arrived at this input number? So therefore, it's extremely important that you include relevant notes. In other words, if you've used a formula to determine an input number, you need to include notes explaining what was included. For example, if you're using 10% for annual revenue growth, you should have a note that says annual revenue growth of 10%. Assume that the CFE marker is looking at a PDF of your Excel spreadsheet. So they're not looking at your cell. They're looking at a PDF copy. So can they determine how you arrived at your input numbers? You don't need to explain basic math such as, contribution margin equals, sales price minus variable costs equals contribution margin. You don't need to explain that. You don't need to explain if you've just simply taken a number, an input number from an exhibit. When it comes to your notes, what normally happens when you look at the solutions is they will have the note beside the specific row, and then they'll have the notes at the bottom when you're the explanation. When you're writing an exam and time is critical, one of the best practices is to include the note and then the number, and then just write in that row what your note is, explaining how you arrived at that input number. A quantitative analysis on its own, even if it's perfect, is not sufficient for a competent response. You must also write a supporting memo explaining the results of your quantitative analysis. And that's not simply saying, please see Exhibit 1. The memo should include, it should absolutely reference the exhibit number. You should state what the amount is. So in other words, if NPV is 100,000, bracket C Exhibit 1. Provide an interpretation of the results. You don't need to state how you calculated and what you considered, because that's all in your Excel spreadsheet. But based on your quantitative analysis, is it a viable option? So I would put NPV is 100,000. See Exhibit 1. So based on quantitative analysis, this is a viable option. Sometimes you need to talk about the key assumptions. Now that's not, again, it's not listing all of the inputs that you used to arrive at the NPV calculation, at the NPV amount. That's in Excel. But based on the case facts, there may be something that indicates that that assumption that you've used for your NPV calculation may be different. So let me provide you an example. So say you've used 10% annual revenue increase, but the case says that the industry annual growth rate is 5%. So that's an important factor to consider and to highlight. So I would say that, you know, revenue increase, annual revenue increase of 10% was used. However, industry benchmark is 5%. If revenue growth is more in line with industry benchmark, this would have a negative impact to NPV. It's important, you don't need to calculate it, but you need to give the user, you need to highlight what would the impact be if that number is different. When it comes to your qualitative analysis, you need to consider both the risks and rewards associated with that decision. And when it comes to, you can either use the subtitles pros, cons, opportunities, risks, advantages, disadvantages, it doesn't matter. One of the things that is really important that many candidates miss is that they simply restate the case fact. That was given to you. You need to include the why. You need to answer that question, so what? What is the potential positive or negative impact to the company? When it comes to your recommendations, it's really important that you provide an integrated, comprehensive recommendation. You'll notice in some of the feedback guides, it'll specifically say that you provided a supported recommendation. A supported recommendation is not when you say, you know, based on my quantitative and qualitative recommendation, based on my quantitative and qualitative analysis, I recommend implementing this option. No. What are the strongest quantitative and qualitative reasons why? Not all qualitative factors are equal. So to meet the recommendation requirement, you need to highlight 2 to 3 of the strongest qualitative reasons why. Now, when you performed your qualitative analysis, if you've identified a key risk, that it's important to provide the user with a mitigated strategy. This will demonstrate and this adds value because remember, you're being tested as an entry-level CPA. So let me provide you with a specific example. So 99.99% of the time, based on the quantitative and qualitative information provided, you should provide the user with a supported recommendation. Now, say maybe that you've calculated a valuation and it's based on unaudited financial statements. And based on your analysis, you know what? It appears that you want to recommend it. However, so you're going to recommend it. However, you are going to emphasize that before they purchase the company, it is important to request audited financials to ensure that the valuation was based on realistic financial information. So again, it's almost like a disclaimer. This is something that they need to look at before they implement that option. So let's talk about financial reporting issues. And for those of you who have watched Understanding CFE, when it comes to level 2, you need to achieve a certain amount of undisclosed competent responses in either financial reporting or management accounting. And the Board of Examiners have found that several candidates struggle when it comes to the financial reporting issues. So as I go through these, I want you to ask yourself, are these areas I struggle with? And as you're writing the past CFE cases, what do I need to know to do differently? So the Board of Examiners have found that candidates fail to recognize the issue, that they've analyzed the issue using the wrong reporting framework. Now, is this the result of a critical reading error? So you've completely missed the trigger. Or is it because of a technical deficiency? The Board of Examiners have found that many candidates have failed to incorporate the appropriate case facts into their analysis. So what they've done is they've simply copied and pasted large sections from the handbook for the criteria, but they have not applied the relevant case facts to support the rationale that that criteria is met. And in some instances, candidates have simply jumped to a conclusion. Even if your recommendation is appropriate, if you haven't performed the requirements when it comes to the analysis, you will not achieve a competent response. The marker needs to understand your rationale and your thought process when you went through the analysis to determine how you arrived at your recommendation. So structuring a financial reporting issue, it's important to use a systematic approach. And I've talked about the IGAR, or, I talked about the variance IGAR-I, and I want to relate it to the CPA way. So the first step of the CPA way is to assess the situation. So ING, issue, and gap involves that step. Step 2 is analyzing the issue. Obviously, A for analyze when it comes to IGAR. Step 3 is your conclude and advise. So that's your R, your recommendation. So let's go through each of these steps. So when you're assessing the situation, it's important to identify the following. What has happened or what are they planning to do? So make sure that you're very clear. Did they already perform a particular journal entry? Or are they just thinking of performing an entry? Because that makes a significant difference when it comes to your recommendation and when it comes to the recommended journal entry that needs to be performed, and the financial impact it will have. So what is the potential issue? Is there more than one financial reporting issue? So let me give you an example. There may be a situation where you know that there was a signing bonus involved, and the user tells you that they've recognized the $150,000 in revenue for the signing bonus. Plus, they also tell you that they recognize they shipped product to a customer that has a 90-day free right of return, and they've recognized that revenue. Those are two separate revenue recognition financial reporting issues. They need to be addressed individually. Which accounting framework? Is it IFRS or ASPE? If you don't use the right framework, it's impossible to to achieve a competent. And who are the key users of the financial statements? What areas are they interested in? Because when you talk about the impact, you need to talk about the impact to the areas they are interested in. Make sure when it comes to your issue statement that you clearly state what the issue is, and that stated in the form of a question. So in other words, the issue is, whether revenue has been correctly identified, correctly recognized. Don't draw a conclusion. Don't state that the issue is that revenue has not been correctly recognized, because that's a conclusion and you haven't performed your analysis. When it comes to step 2 of the analysis, it's important the best practice is to really take each of the criteria, and you need to go through every single criteria. Paraphrase those in your own words. That will save you valuable time. I strongly recommend that you are very comfortable, make sure that you're very comfortable with the financial reporting issues, the criteria, when it comes to those that are proficiency level A. Now, you do have access to the handbook, and yes, you can copy information from the handbook, but it's not value added of copying entirely large sections. So paraphrase the criteria individually. Under each criteria, apply the relevant case fact and state whether that criteria is met or not. So after you've performed your analysis, normally you end up providing the user with a recommendation. However, in some circumstances, the user has an opportunity, they have an accounting policy choice. And if that's the case, then you need to explain the choice and you need to consider the user's objectives. So let me give you an example. Under ASPE, when it comes to development costs, if it meets the criteria for intangible assets, the user has the option of capitalizing those development costs, or they can expense it. So you need to talk about that accounting policy and discuss what their objectives are. For your recommendation, it's critical that you provide a recommendation for each of the reporting issues or sub-issues. When you provide a recommendation, clearly state what you are recommending and why you are recommending it. When it comes to revenue recognition, if you're recommending that it cannot be recognized, you need to clearly state when it can be recognized. Make sure that your recommendation is consistent with your analysis. So let's talk about that example when it comes to the development costs. So if the user's objectives is that they want to minimize tax payable, then your recommendation would be that they expense the development costs. If the user is looking at borrowing money from the bank, and we know that the bank is interested in the company's cash flow, and cash flow, net income is a proxy for cash flow. So you would recommend that they capitalize those development costs because that would have a much lower impact on net income. Make sure too that a good conclusion explains and quantifies wherever possible the impact that your recommendation is going to have on those financial areas that the user is interested in. So does it increase or decrease income? If there's any covenants, is it going to have a positive or negative impact? Make sure that you provide them with the appropriate adjustment, because most likely you're going to need to perform those adjustments and maybe potentially update net income before you determine and calculate materiality, for an example. So hence the reason why I say use and include the impact as an additional subtitle, because that reminds you to do that. So based on the advice that I provided, and if you consistently use the IGAR format, it will ensure that your response is clear, concise, and easy to follow. Plus, it will save you valuable time. So let's talk about what are the Board of Examiners' expectations. There are 5 different ratings when it comes to each of the assessment opportunities. There's not address, so you didn't address it at all. Nominal competency, which means it was just a superficial attempt. Reaching competent, which means that you've either met the breadth and or depth requirement. Competent means that you've met both the breadth and depth, and competent with distinction means that you've exceeded those. So if you notice here, I've X'd out not addressed and nominal competent because, as I said in the understanding CFE, that performance against those assessment opportunities will not be considered when it comes to the requirements for level 1, 2, 3, and 4. I've also crossed out competent with distinction, and I've done that on purpose because, again, I highlighted in that webinar that there's no extra value given to you between a competent respond and a competent with distinction. So don't put in the extra effort that's needed to achieve a competent with distinction, because most likely that means that you're going to end up with, not potentially not addressing another required or normal competency. So the 2 areas for the expectations are competent and reaching competent. Again, I go into great detail when it comes to understanding the CFE. So I've talked about breadth and depth. So what is breadth when it comes to the qualitative analysis? It's identifying a sufficient number of appropriate qualitative factors based on the case facts provided. From a quantitative perspective, it's identifying a sufficient number of appropriate inputs. Now, if someone tells you, oh, I know exactly how many qualitative factors you need to achieve a competent response, it's all conjecture. The only people who know are the people who created the exam and marked the exam, and they're not going to tell anyone. So there are some fundamental principles. The more qualitative factors they give, the more that they expect. You don't need to extract all of the qualitative factors to achieve a competent. When it comes to depth, from a qualitative perspective, that's answering that question, so what? Discussing the why and the impact. From a quantitative perspective, that's interpreting the results. Is it viable from a quantitative perspective? Identifying, if appropriate, the key assumptions and discussing the impact that would have to the results. Reaching competent, as I said, is you've identified the assessment opportunity, but your response lacks either the depth and or the required breadth. So as you start to write your responses for the previous CFE exams, ask yourself, were you able to identify all of the assessment opportunities? Okay. If there was a reading challenge, then make sure that you go through the walkthrough document. That'll help you with identifying the triggers. Do you have the technical knowledge to adequately address all of the assessment opportunities? If not, make sure that when you're debriefing, make appropriate notes, add it to your study plan, and then practice that particular skill. Were you able to effectively communicate your response in an appropriate way? Because when it comes to day 2, day 3, and even day 1, your enabling competencies could be the difference between passing and not passing CFE. It's your ability to write an effective and efficient response, your ability to manage your time well, and your ability to identify the key factors that you need to consider when performing your analysis and providing your recommendations. So the goal is to ensure and to demonstrate that you have a clear understanding of the key factors that should be considered when you perform your analysis, because that demonstrates that your analysis is sound. And it also supports that your recommendations are viable and credible. It's not about information dumping. It's not about dumping every bit of information that you know and hoping that some of that will be what they want. From a technical expectation perspective, remember your competency map is your syllabus. During the stress management webinar, I do show you how to sort the competency map Excel spreadsheet. So if you haven't watched that, please watch that. When it comes to the proficiency level, remember for day 2, your role, you're being tested at the elective level. And for day 1 and day 3, you're being tested at the core level. As you go through and as you're preparing to write CFE, it's important to track your performance. And as you're debriefing, kind of, categorize your performance into the 3 buckets. Are there behaviors that are deterrent? If so, things like, you're reading too quickly, you're not watching your time, you're not including the relevant case facts. Make yourself a note. Remind yourself, slow down, extract the relevant case facts. Did you identify the triggers? Okay. Is there areas that you need to review? So make sure that that's on your study plan. There's lots of resources available to you. So when it comes to day 2 and day 3, there's sample cases. Everyone has access to Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. There's some study material there. And there's 18 units, so there's 16 day 3 cases and 2 day 2 cases. They provide you the case, solution, feedback guide, debrief, notes, and walkthrough. If you're enrolled in Capstone 2, you also have access, besides the Capstone 2 cases, you're also going to have access to additional practice cases, some more day 2 and day 3 cases that run from September 2015 to May 2024. When it comes to day 1 cases, if you're enrolled in Capstone 2, you'll have access to the module workshop day 1 case, week 3 and I have week 4, but it should be week 6, day 1 cases. So you have access to 3 day 1 cases. If you are challenging the exam, so you will not have access to sample cases for the cases that you're writing, but you do have access to the Board of Examiner reports, and you have access to 17 previous day 1 cases. They'll provide the case and the marking guides and solutions. There are some great information on enabling competencies under the ebook and competency flashcards. Again, you can find that under the Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. And I just want to show you one of the the flashcards. So you can download them. It gives you the instructions on how to print. It doesn't have all of the technical skills that you need to that are testable, but it's a good start. And of course, the CFE support webinar series. So as I said, stress management and understanding the CFE, those recordings are available. The recording for this webinar will be available shortly. On July the 22nd, I'm going to be doing time management and day 3. And on July 28th and 29th, I'm going to do a deep dive in how to pass day 1. So July the 28th, I'm going to go through MEI. And on July the 29th, I'm going to go through STC. And those recordings, as I said, will be available under Introduction to Capstone 2 and CFE. So now I would like to open the floor for any questions that you may have.
All right. No, thanks there, Debbie, for today's presentation. So we'll have approximately 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A today, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. We do have my colleagues there in the back who are answering any questions through the Q&A function. So please use that if you're able to ask any questions that you have regarding today's topic. So the first question we'll go to there, Debbie, is it came in through a candidate here. So I kind of kept it here for this part here. So the question is, when concluding, what if my variance analysis shows a particular issue as favorable, assuming it's correct, but there's significant qualitative case facts that indicated it should be unfavorable. So how should the candidate approach the solution? So essentially there, you've got like one thing where it's leaning towards one way and one thing leaning towards the other way. So what's your advice if a candidate encounters this type of situation?
Sure. Well, I find when it comes to the variance analysis, you need to normally calculate a few items to get to the standard quality or so just do a quick relook. Make sure that you go back to the case and just do a quick relook at your numbers and make sure that you've got the correct information. Because as I said, based on what the case facts are providing in the Elgard situation, gee, they're not accounting for wastage. So that means that, there's probably, it looks like they're using more material than they actually are. So I would take a second look at my numbers because if there's something contradicting, that means that there's something incorrect.
All right. No, thanks there, Debbie, for that there. So I'll just go on to a couple other questions here as well. So this question has come up in previous webinars, and we wanted to make sure it's addressed here because a lot of candidates may think about this in terms of approaching day 2. So this question usually comes up is in terms of, is it a good approach to go through the role-specific assessment opportunities first and then come back to address the financial reporting or MA? Or do you have another suggestion on how candidates should approach the common AOs and the role-specific AOs there?
Okay, so I love this question, and I know kind of what's behind the question because, as you know, the only day 2 is the only time you have an opportunity to meet that undisclosed number of competent responses in your role. So it's critical to complete all of your role assessment opportunities. However, remember when we were talking about the planning process, one of the important considerations is your analysis of one of the assessment opportunities and your recommendations impact your analysis of another required? So let me give you a very good example that it happens a lot. So say your role is audit. Maybe you're going to one of your role specific requirements is to calculate materiality. Well, if you go to do your role specific assessment opportunities first and you haven't done your financial reporting issues, then you're not going to make the appropriate adjustments when you go to calculate materiality, which in the end will result in not achieving a competent response. So you need to address the requireds in the appropriate order. And that does not mean in the order in which they're given, but you need to address them in the order that is required when it comes to does your analysis of one of your assessment opportunities impact your analysis of another. Another example is for performance management. Many times you need to make adjustments in one required that's going to impact your analysis of another for your role specific. So it could be a common, because in day two, you're tested on common financial reporting issues, so issues that everybody has to do, and then common management uh, requireds. Well, that analysis, some of those common requireds could impact your role specific. So starting with your role specific is not the appropriate strategy. The appropriate strategy is to determine what order they need to be completed, allocate your time for each of the required, and do them all to the best of your ability within the time frame you have, because I've seen many instances where there were more than, there might have been, in PM in particular, I've seen where your analysis of one of the assessment opportunities impacted, I think it was two or three of the role specific requireds. So that's a gamble I would not want to take.
All right, thanks there, Debbie. So we'll move on here. There's a lot of questions about paraphrasing. So essentially here, what the question's referring to is when candidates refer to the handbook, so um, the, I think you mentioned there that they can directly paste and extract in the answer, or they can paraphrase. But the
Right.
question would be is, how much should they copy and write from the handbook itself? And how much should they paraphrase, and what's probably the best approach to use there when referencing the handbook?
Sure. Well, first of all, revenue recognition, ASPE 3400, IFRS 15, you should be able to paraphrase that criteria. You should know it inside out, upside down, and backwards. So that's something you shouldn't have to look up in the handbook. Paraphrase it in your own words. And if you paraphrase something in your own words, then you just need to say, as per ASPE or as per IFRS. If you extract information from the handbook, you need to state ASPE 3400, the paragraph, and so on. What I would do is, again, I would save and use and refer and copy and paste information from the handbook that I'm not really comfortable with. So again, I would make sure that as I'm going through the list of those financial reporting issues that are proficiency level A, that I'm comfortable in paraphrasing that, that criteria, because it also takes a lot less time. However, there may be some of the candidates, some of you may be very good and efficient, and you can, you know what, you can go through Notion and provide that and find that information quickly, then that's great. But remember, you will never achieve a competent response if you're simply copying and pasting large sections from the handbook.
All right, that's great there. So I'm going to try to do this really quickly, just trying to get us through as many questions as possible. So one question's come up. So candidates may encounter a situation, they got time constraints and they're not able to complete the full-fledged quantitative analysis. So are candidates allowed to make a recommendation without doing the complete quants due to time constraints?
Okay, so if you do have time constraints, then the key would be to do as much as you possibly can. And yes, you do know that you need to provide a recommendation. 99.9% of the time, you need to provide a recommendation to meet a competent response. What I would do is if you need to calculate NPV and you don't have enough time to include all of the inputs, I would include as many inputs as I can and still calculate NPV. So, I would make sure that I'm doing some kind of attempt. And, it's important to get past, and I know this is very hard for a lot of you to get past the fact that it doesn't need to be perfect. So put in as much information as you can, calculate the NPV, because remember, it doesn't need to be perfect.
All right, thanks there, Debbie. Another question that's come in is this is more for writing the response. So the question is, so for each assessment opportunity, do the candidates have to name it like AO1 or AO2, or should candidates just write the response as if they're just writing it typically and not like specify this
Yeah.
this is related to a specific AO?
Yeah, no, in a professional, because really you're acting as a CPA. And so in a professional memo, you would never say AO1, AO2. Okay. Those numbers are used in the feedback guide so that you can reference them. So if you notice in the outline that I shared, I just used the required as the heading. So no, you do not. And in a professional memo, you shouldn't include AO1, AO2.
All right, perfect. And then as some candidates here have noticed, yeah, the webinar is tomorrow, July 23rd, for
Oh,
time management. So it might say 22nd there, but thanks for the catch in regards to there. But
thank
same
you
time,
guys. Sorry about that.
so it'll be on tomorrow on day 3 in time management. So to register for that webinar, please refer to the newsfeed post within Capstone 2 and Introduction to Capstone 2 to attend that accordingly. It's going to be at the same time, so that makes it easier there, but it'll be at a different link. Another question that's come up, this is more for clarification because you did talk about outlining there, Debbie. So a couple questions that come up is that does the outline count for marks, or is it just the response where candidates get credit for the response?
Yeah, it's just the response. And if you use the best practice that I've shared with you, actually there is no outline left. Okay, so what happens is if you don't use the information, you're going to delete it, like the timeline and the users and there's objectives, you're going to delete that information and it's going to be your response. So no, if you've included in your document kind of, an outline and you've included relevant case facts, no, it's not considered part of your response. They're not going to look at that. They're going to look at, where you have to, from, CPA, and then what is your real response?
All right, perfect. So we do apologize if we're not able to answer all your questions here, as we got quite a few of them that have come in here. So we're trying to get through as many as we can. So we do apologize for that there. So we got a couple of minutes left here. Questions come up. I've seen this come about in regards to the use of formulas in Excel. Well, technically not Excel, it's Surpass in
Yes.
terms of that there, Debbie. So for formulas, when candidates use formulas within Surpass, do they need to mention which formula they use? Do they need to outline the requirements, like the inputs for the formulas? And this is more for opinion, like in which situations should they not rely on formulas versus, oh, these formulas are perfectly acceptable?
Oh, so as far as you don't really need to explain and provide notes for the formulas, except again, if you look at the input numbers. So let me give you an example. So say you're doing an NPV and under year 0, you have a total of $1 million. And but within that, how you arrived at that $1 million is, say, I don't know, equipment is 400,000. The building is, boy, this is cheap building, $600,000. Well, you need to explain how you arrived at that $1 million. Because again, the CFE marker is going to be looking at a PDF copy. So they're just going to see $1 million. Well, what is that? The initial investment. Because there's most likely, you know what, the requirements that are outlined is for the equipment and for the building. So that's what you need to include in your notes. So how did you arrive at that? If you use the annual increase of revenue of 10%, if you maybe used 85% for cost of goods sold, then you need to put that in your notes. But you don't need to explain. And, I've seen instances where candidates have said, A plus B equals C. And you'll notice even in the solution, they do that, but they do that because the solutions are a learning tool. And so they want you to see how they calculated it. But when you're being tested, they just need to know what did you consider if you needed to perform any kind of calculation for an input number. So hopefully that helps.
Perfect. And this will be the last question. So again, I do apologize for time constraints here, but I left this purposely for the final question here. So for the practice cases and as well for the board of examiners cases, candidates will get access to the actual solution in regards to those particular documents. So a lot of candidates may ask, is this the standard that is expected from us? During the CFE responses there. And sometimes those examiners' calculations could be different than the candidate's own, or if you're working with a peer and all that stuff. So, want to get your thoughts on that there, Debbie, just more on the expectations on candidates'
Absolutely.
responses too.
I love this question. Well, first of all, the solution is perfect. Okay. It's well above what the expectations are for competent response. It was not done within the time frame that was given, and it was not done by one person. There could have been many people who have contributed to that response. So I always think about the solution as a learning tool. That's not the standard that you want to hold yourself accountable to. Look at, so they provide sample candidate responses. Look at those sample candidate responses. I normally have the response on half my screen, and then I also have on the other half, I have the marked feedback guide. So I look and say, okay, first of all, for this required, did they achieve a competent response? Reading kind of what they, what the marker assessed it at, their comments, and then I look at the sample response, because this is a better guide in what can be done for by one person within the time frame that you're given. So the board of examiners, they will even provide you with a competent response by a real candidate that wrote that exam. That's the standard that you need to look at and hold yourself accountable to, not that solution. And so I find sometimes the sample response too, from a quantitative perspective, they might have done something that may be a little easier, but other times the solution, you know what? I'm like, oh, there's something there that I really learned. They provided me with a clearer explanation that will help me learn and do a better job the next time I have that particular required. So I use the solutions as a learning tool, not as the standard to set, my expectations by.
All right. No, thanks there, Debbie. And yeah, we're out of time for tonight's webinar there. So we thank everybody for joining us for tonight's session. And thank you, Debbie, for presenting there tonight. We'll have another session tomorrow, which will focus on the topic of day 3 and time management. So we encourage everybody to come on and attend that live. And if you're not able to, feel free to review the recording. Please just give us a couple of days to upload the recording onto the YouTube site. So just to let you guys know, and once it's available, we will let you guys know accordingly. So, on behalf of everybody here, we thank you guys for attending tonight's event and have a great rest of the night.
Thanks, guys.